Thank you for joining us for this Contingency Planning Rule webinar. I'm Dave Prouty, a training specialist for animal care, and I will serve as your facilitator for today's webinar. Today's presenters are Randall Wagner, a USDA animal care inspector in Nebraska and Iowa, Dr. Don Barksdale, a USDA animal care veterinary medical officer in Illinois and southern Wisconsin. And we also have panelists available to answer your questions. Dr. Martha Keller, the director of USDA's Animal Care Center for Animal Welfare, and Dr. Aaron Reiner, assistant director for USDA Animal Care Animal Welfare Operations. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll be notified when the recording is available on APHIS YouTube. The link to the recording will be posted on the Contingency Planning website. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can submit them via the question box, and we'll answer them as time permits. I will now turn it over to Dr. Bob Gibbons, the Director for USDA Animal Care Animal Welfare Operations. Bob?
Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon or evening to everybody, I guess depending on your location. As Dave said, welcome to the webinar on our Contingency Planning Rule. I hope you're all doing well. Before we get started, I wanted to give a brief description of how we got to this point. In December 2012, we issued a regulation that established the requirement for facilities regulated under the Animal Welfare Act to have a contingency plan in place in case of a disaster. The rule was stayed by the Secretary of Agriculture 7 months later. So now with the publishing of this rule, that stay has been lifted. As before, the rule helps ensure that regulated facilities are prepared to safeguard the health and welfare of their animals in the event of emergencies or disasters. In general, you will need to have a plan that identifies emergency situations that are common in your local area, outline tasks that need to be carried out in response to the identified emergencies or disasters, identify who at your facility will be responsible for fulfilling each of those tasks, and address what you will need to do in terms of materials, resources, and training. During the webinar, we will get into details that will help with the development of your plan, and we will, as already mentioned, we'll have some times for questions at the end. But before I turn it over to the presenters, I do want to make one important reminder. Your written plan is required to be in place by July 5th of this year. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Randall Wagner.
Thank you, Dr. Gibbons. And thank all you colleagues and friends for this opportunity to present this contingency rule PowerPoint. And as Dr. Gibbons mentioned, good afternoon or evening, depending where you're at. So today we'll be covering the origins and history of the contingency rule, the actual requirements and resources to support those changes. So let's get a little bit of the backdrop on it. But before that, when the team and I was putting this deal together, it reminded me of when I was in the service station in Georgia. Hurricane Andrew hit the Homestead, Florida area. I had a roommate who won the humanitarian service ribbon for operating a radio so supplies could be brought in. I do remember exotic animals being on the news on TV, which were loose, and also a big concern at that time was pets not being able to be evacuated with their owners. So it's been a long time coming for something like this. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Dave. Sorry. So what is contingency planning? It's planning to mitigate unexpected events or circumstances. It's a backup plan prepared for a scenario that may or may not happen. A contingency plan doesn't always have to be for a bad event. Sometimes it's for great things like what happens if your business grows by 100% or more? Do you have current funding for it? But for the discussion today, contingency plan is for disasters that are likely to happen at your animal welfare regulated animal business, or as I like to put it, for a more favorable outcome. Next slide, please. probably talked about contingency planning before at home with your family, like for floods or tornadoes or what to do during a fire. If you ever talked about these terms before, these terms are more or less contingency planning. It's not necessarily complicated, but there is planning and training involved. If you ever attended a fire drill in a public school or at your workplace, you participated in contingency exercise and training. People know how to get out of the building when the alarm sounds. That's planning and training. And doing the actual drill is an exercise. You find out where the planning went wrong. Maybe the siren sound doesn't reach all corners of the building. So now you know where you need an extra siren, like in the break room or a wing of the building. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, I mentioned Hurricane Andrew. The catapult for all this, the big game changer was Hurricane Katrina. Animals owned by private individuals and organizations were left behind because the storm didn't look that big at landfall. Well, the area might have been ready for the storm, but definitely they were not ready for the floods to come with the levees breaking. Many pets and research animals were cut off for a week or weeks. A lot of animals after a week on their own were in terrible shape, and some had to be euthanized. A local zoo in the area was fortunate to be on high ground, so it was mostly okay, even though they suffered greatly from their staff being affected. As a result, Animal Care decided it's time to require the regulated community to plan for emergencies like it had already required for marine mammal facilities to do. Meanwhile, the media and Congress was planning for the PETS Act, the Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act, to tie disaster relief funding to help people evacuate with their pets. Next slide, please. And just like this flow chart, as we learned here recently, you also want to plan, or your plan should reflect illness or injury to the owner or key employees or managers or players in the plan. Obviously, we learned this through COVID. Just like healthy research animals make for better science, strong contingency planning makes for good animal welfare. It all makes for healthier, more resilient animal business. Next slide, please. And as you remember, echoing what Dr. Gibbons mentioned in open comments, the rule was approved in 2012 and was stayed. January 3rd, 2022, the rule went into effect. And July 5th of 2022, facilities are required to have a contingency plan, and this will be part of the inspection process. Next slide, please. So let's get into the crux of the objectives and the requirements. You're probably wondering, what is the difference about it this time and what is required? Next slide, please. Here it is, the language straight out of the regulation. Provide for humane care for the animals in the event of emergency or disaster, one which could be reasonably anticipated and expected to be detrimental to the good health and well-being. But how does it translate into what the entities have to do? Next slide, please. A couple of things. Remember, marine mammals were already required to be covered by the contingency planning. And 2.102 also has a contingency mention under handlers. So the other person or premises must be either directly included in the dealer or exhibitor's contingency plan required under 2.134 and must develop its own contingency plan in accordance with section 2.134. So this is what our inspectors will be looking for. We'll break it down in the next slides for you. Next slide, please. Here are the bare bones of the rule. When it goes into effect, it is required. The plan, as we mentioned earlier, must be in place by July 5th, 2022, or 180 days from the final rule going into effect, which was January 3rd, 2022. Plan must identify when the plan is put into action, when, Outline specific tasks to be carried out. What? Identify a chain of command and responsibility for the task. Who? Address materials, resources, and training needed. How? Next slide, please. Additional requirements are listed here, but you can also use our Form 7093, which is now posted on Animal Care's webpage. It's not required, but it's a good guidance document. The additional requirements, though, are a plan must be available for inspection, and plans must go with traveling entities, which would, for example, would be exhibitors. Entities must review the plan annually and document review and in-term modifications. You can use the optional form APHIS 7093, as we mentioned, on our webpage. Training must be provided to personnel within 60 days of the plan being put in place. Inspectors will be looking that you have your plan reviewed and dated annually. We suggest you add a line at the end of your plan to remind yourself to review it yearly. That's if you use the optional form 7093 and or write one up yourself. Some facilities built this activity into like a safety day they have during a year or a holiday, so it's an annual ritual. You can also, under Section 2 of the APHIS Form 7093, initial and document annual review of your plan. Next slide, please. Do you know the answers to the most basic questions? There are a lot of words in the reg, but we're necessarily asking you to address 4 basic questions. When, what, who, and how. Next slide, please. When. Here's the language from the reg and the gray at the bottom, but here's the point in plain language. When do you trigger an action? What emergencies are most likely for your facility? The rule affects all different animal types, businesses, breeders to exhibitors, research, and those who transport animals. It also affects businesses all across the U.S. Each area has its own challenges: electrical outages, facility HVAC systems failing, fires, animal escapes, dangerous animal escapes, floods, and weather. Next slide, please. What actions do you take? Examples: call the fire department if there's a fire, call local public safety if dangerous animals loose, take shelter and secure buildings in a tornado situation. Next slide, please. Who needs that? Who's in charge of doing what? Examples. No, all examples include both who and what. Animal keepers of dangerous animals are in charge of handling them. A safety officer directs the visitor flow. A facility manager calls employees if they're not needed to come in. They might be safer at home. Maybe you need them to stay out of the way. A spokesperson starts handling message traffic to social media and news outlets. Next slide, please. How? How will you make all this happen? How is the big question and the stuff you need to get all this done, such as how will you move your animals? How will you make calls if landlines are down? How will you close up your facility? Next slide, please. Planning. The big takeaway from here is, remember, this contingency plan is a living document. It'll be changing as your staff, animals, and other situations and facets do. I believe it was General Eisenhower who said, we talk about the plan, but what is more important is the planning. A plan is useful if it's written up by someone who doesn't know how your facility works and then sits untouched on a bookshelf for 5 years. Contingency planning is a process and not a static thing. Calling lists are no good if they're outdated. Conversely, don't waste time finding and testing emergency transportation for tigers if you no longer have tigers. Keep fine-tuning your plan, document changes, training for those improvements. Also, keep documenting for unseen disasters. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my team member and colleague, Dr. Don Barksdale. Don?
Thank you, Randall. And now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the training. As Randall and Dr. Gibbons mentioned before, July 5th is day 0. After July 5th, all existing employees on board within 30 days of the plan being put into place, which is represented by the blue bar here, have 60 days of the plan being put in place, represented by the yellow bar, to get trained. Hires after those first 30 days of the plan being in place, the blue bar, have 30 days from their hiring to get trained. So just to recap, current employees as of August 4th, 22, must be trained by September 3rd, 22, within 60 days of your plan being in place. New employees after August 4th, 22, must be trained within 30 days of that hire date. Next slide. If you haven't looked at our optional form 7093, have a good look at it. It'll guide you through the basics of planning. Next slide. Section 2 of the form reminds you to maintain, train to, and document your planning. Review of the plan is required once a year, and changes have to be documented. Space is on the form for you to do that right here. Next slide. Section 3 asks you to collect important contact information together in one place. We don't want you to bury this information in files or on a bookshelf. When you need it, having it all together isn't helpful if you can't find the list. We would encourage you to post this list by your phones or in a common place. Next slide. Section 4 guides you through some common types of emergencies. This is just a starting point. Only you know what's likely to happen in your area and your facilities. Some examples might be for research facilities and exhibitors, HVAC failures, fires, escapes, adverse weather impacting the workforce, and unauthorized persons interfacing with the animals. For ground transporters, it could be accidents, vehicle malfunction, animal illness during the trip, escapes, or theft of animals. Next slide. This section reminds you to think through a who, what, and how. You'll see that the examples even list the position. Sometimes that's more useful than listing a name because people move around in organizations, people come and go. We want you to keep your list as up to date as possible. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about a few resources. Next slide. There are a lot of resources out there, and we're just highlighting a few, as you can see here. Next slide. Animal Care has posted a new webpage about the contingency planning at this link. From there, you can link to the optional form 7093, the Blue Book, and the Animal Care Aid, Keeping Animals Safe During Emergencies. Next slide. Animal Care has also created 2 tech notes, a 1-page quick reference and a 2-page development guide that are both downloadable from our publications website. Next slide. The Ready.gov series of websites prepares schools, families, businesses, and others for disasters. It's general, but a good starting place to give you an outline for you so you can help prepare for your disaster. Next slide. Animal Care has been funding a project with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums for about a decade. It's evolved over the years, but the current name is ZAP, the Zoo All Hazards Partnership. Some of you may have attended or otherwise been involved in these activities. While it's zoo-centric, it's also touched on adjacent areas like cervid ranches and the Veterinary Services Red Book, their operational plans on dealing with certain foreign animal diseases like high path avian influenza. These ZAP resources are certainly adaptable to other non-zoo regulated entities. There are quite a lot of good stuff on their website. Next slide. And currently, there's a bird flu high path outbreak going on all across the country. USDA has heard from concerned zoos, bird rehabilitators, and other bird industries and organizations. Animal Care is not the regulatory lead for this outbreak, but we do have a supporting role since Veterinary Services, our sister program, is largely consumed with poultry and trade issues. If you do have a suspect case, your first stop is your state veterinarian's office. Make sure you have that contact information at hand during this outbreak. Next slide. And now we'll take questions, and I'll turn it back to you, Dave. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dawn. First question, what is meant by personnel?
Let me go ahead and take that one, Dave. So personnel would really be anyone that is involved in the care of your animals. We certainly hope that you, if needed, extend that training to other folks. For instance, if you're an exhibitor, a dangerous animal escape, you may need the food vendors to know what to do during animal escapes. But for the purposes of the rule, it's really anyone involved in the care of your animal.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Next question, does that mean that training must be completed at the latest 60 days after July 5th?
Dawn, you want to take that one?
Yes, it does mean that 60 days after, by September of 2022, needs to be trained. All the personnel should be trained that would be involved.
Okay, thank you, Dawn. Next question, who must review the plan annually? There's an assumption at our institution, it's the IACUC. Should it be the facility staff with the person in charge of executing the plan?
So there's no specification in the regulations regarding who is involved in the review of the plan. So we leave it up to your individual facilities to determine who's best suited for that role. Our requirement is simply that it is reviewed annually.
Okay, thank you. Next question. When is retraining on the plan required? Annually when the plan is reviewed, or only if/when the plan is changed?
Yeah, so it's within the 60 days of when the plan is put in place. So if the plan is changed, then it would require retraining. So you'd have another 60 days after that.
All right, thank you, Martha. Next question, what is acceptable documentation of training?
I can take that one again. So Documentation, we don't require documentation of training. We simply require that there is some documentation of when they were trained. So we need to know that they were trained within those 60 days.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Who needs to participate in the annual review of the plan?
I think we kind of already went over that on the question a few ago. So it's really whoever you feel is pertinent to be involved. Our requirement is simply that you show that the plan has been reviewed within the year.
Okay, thank you. Please elaborate on how you want changes or revisions to the plan to be documented. How long do you want us to keep these changes on file?
So the revisions or changes, there just needs to be a date on when there was any revisions. In terms of how long to keep the changes on file, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I have the answer to that. So Dave, if we can keep that question, we'll make sure that we post the answer on our webpage once I look into that.
Okay, will do. Thank you, Martha. Next question. What is the Blue Book as referred to on slide 27?
Randy, you want to take that one?
Yes, I believe the Blue Book, they're referring to the regulation book.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Next question. Can you give us an example of what acceptable training would be for an administrative personnel, such as a communications director, as part of the training process? They don't have hands-on responsibilities, but are called out on our plan. Is it acceptable that they are simply educated on their role by review of their role?
Yeah, so this is similar to a previous question. So we're not specifying how you train or what level of training needs to take place. If you have your administrative personnel as part of the plan, I think that's great because everyone is often involved in specific situations. I would say train them to the level that you're comfortable with. And as long as you can show that they've received the training and show the date, that's really all we're going to be looking for.
Okay, thank you. Is there a threshold for the size of a zoo/facility, number of species/animals, or some other criteria to trigger a requirement for contingency planning? Do city, county, and state animal control facilities need to plan?
So really, this requirement is only for facilities that are regulated by USDA Animal Care. So if you have a current license or registration with us, then you fall under this contingency rule. If you do not, then we do not regulate.
Thank you, Martha. Next question. Are these required to be submitted to USDA or only available and presented when asked?
Don, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, it's only required that it's just available when the inspector comes, but it's not something that you have to send to the inspector. It's just when the inspector comes to do the inspection, just to have it available, just like the other records.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does that include to train investigators, students, etc.? You're muted, Martha. Are you unmuted? Not hearing you. Okay. Karen, can you help me out with that? Can anybody answer that question other than Martha?
I can. So repeat the question again, just to be sure it's clear.
Yeah.
Students train
They're
investigators.
asking. Yeah, they're asking for the training. Does the training, I guess, include training investigators and students?
The training includes the training would include anybody involved at the facility during a disaster. So if the investigators or students are involved, I guess yes. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does this requirement apply to USDA Animal Welfare Act exhibitor's license or just USDA APHIS permits?
It also
Can you hear me now,
applies
Dave?
to- Oh,
Yes.
Okay. I can take this one, Randy.
I got it if you're okay.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
It applies to exhibitors. In fact, if they're I mentioned in my slide presentation, if they're traveling entities, they're supposed to take a copy of it with them. And depending where they go to, you know, wherever fairgrounds, you should take consideration the potential plans you may need there, like for tornado warnings or floods or what have you. So an animal escapes in that. So hope that answers it.
Okay, thank you. I think this next one's already been asked, but I'll go ahead and ask it anyway. What qualifies as training? Is having someone sign off on reading it adequate, or are presentations and or drills required?
Yeah, we did kind of cover that. So again, we're not specifying how you have to do the training, what type of training you have to do, simply that you have documented that the personnel are trained. So it's really at your discretion what you think is appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Next question, who has to sign this document?
Don, you want to take that one?
Yes, whoever you feel is appropriate and who's trained and who would be responsible for the training would be appropriate to sign it. So we don't have a requirement for a specific person, but that would be up to the facility to decide who would be best to sign the document.
Okay, thank you, Don. Will slides of this presentation be available?
Yes, we will put the slides as well as a recording of the presentation on our contingency webpage, which is on our animal care website. May take a few days, but they'll get on there.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Next two, I think we've already covered, but I'll ask them that. So what kind of documentation is needed to show training is completed to satisfy an inspection? And I think Martha already answered that, but that's really up to the facility. And then are training records / documentation required?
So again, we don't require documentation showing what the training was, simply that folks were trained and the date that they were trained.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Next question. I am a broker of animals and never take possession or hold any animals. Do I need a contingency plan?
Yes, you would still need a contingency plan, even though most likely you never take possession or hold any animals, there's always the off chance that something could happen and you do end up with animals. So that's why we require it of anyone that is licensed or registered by Animal Care.
Okay, thank you. So all animals in a facility must be accounted for in this plan, mammals, birds, reptile, and aquatic.
So for the purposes of our regulations, we only regulate mammals at this time. Obviously, as you hopefully are aware, we will start regulating birds next year, late next year, most likely. So for currently, only your mammals. However, if you do have other types of species, birds, reptiles, aquatic, we would strongly recommend you include them. If you're going through the process of developing a plan, we would recommend you include it, but it's certainly not a requirement.
Okay, thank you. I guess this person, so this facility has different departments for different type of animals, and should they have a contingency plan for each department?
So really, I would say it's up to you how you choose to do it. Our inspectors, when they go, will just verify that the plan covers all of the regulated animals. So if you choose to have separate plans for your separate departments, that would still meet the regulations.
Okay, thank you. How does this differ from the disaster plan requirements that have been required for quite some time?
So OLA has had requirements in place. They may not, I don't know the specifics on those requirements offhand, they may not differ significantly from ours, but in terms of animal care, this is the first time starting on July 5th that we will have the regulation to require contingency plans put in place at facilities. So I'm sure this questioner is at a research facility, so it may not be something new to them, and that's great. But certainly it is new to some of our other facilities, our breeders, our brokers, our exhibitors, our transporters, et cetera.
Thank you, Martha. Can't just publish our updated plans as needed or annually. You want the changes documented. How do you want them documented? What kinds of changes need to be documented?
So provided that you can show what you changed and when, that's really all that the regulations require. You can show the changes and you can show the dates and when essentially the new plan was put into place. You can publish them if you like, but our inspectors are still going to ask for them when they visit your facilities for an inspection.
Okay, thank you. I'm at an academic institution. It is clear that our vets, animal care handlers, and vivarium managers should undergo training. But what about principal investigators and their research staff?
So again, you're probably starting to sense the theme that we've left this rule purposely very, very flexible and very, very open. So if the folks that was at the principal investigators and research staff would play no part in activating a contingency plan, then it doesn't seem that you'd need to train them. If they play a part, any type of part, even if it's coordination on the ground from some remote location, we would recommend that they be trained. So we leave that to the facility's discretion.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Where can I view an example of an approved contingency plan by facility type?
So we don't have any quote unquote approved plans, primarily because the regulation is not July 5th yet, you can always, and we strongly recommend this, contact your local inspector, or you can contact this website or the email that's right on this screen, animalcare@usda.gov, or call our office if you have any questions about meeting the requirements. Our inspectors are fielding a lot of calls right now, and they're very happy, more than willing, to go over your contingency plan and give you any comments, suggestions, and answer any questions that you may have. But we don't have any approved plans for viewing.
Okay, thank you. Do we need to submit the form to particular parties by a deadline?
No, so the form does not need to be submitted. The form is not even mandatory. The form is an optional form that can help you. It should, if you fill that form out, you should be meeting all of the requirements, the regulatory requirements. You just need to have it in place and on available for your inspectors when they arrive at your facility.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Next question. I noticed that there was no mention of pandemics and the need for social distancing and dealing with a smaller workforce due to illness and the impact on IACUC oversight. Would you expect this to be addressed in the plan as well?
So Randall did touch on that a bit. I think his audio went out slightly while he was talking about that. Really, what we're not going to look at your plans and say you forgot something. It's, you know, your facilities best and know what to plan for. Obviously, COVID had a great impact on probably everyone on this call and every facility that's represented on this call. So it would be a great idea to include something like that. But again, we are not specifying what you need to include on your contingency plan. We're leaving that up to your discretion, what you feel you need to plan for.
Great, thank you. Does a complete retrain need to occur if a new person responsible is added, since that technically changes the plan?
So I think that's probably something that's an interesting question. I think provided that they're already trained on what to do, I don't think that really changes the plan. It would be advisable if an assigned person is different, that they be retrained on their new requirements, but the plan essentially hasn't changed, provided that the plan, like Don mentioned, has the responsible parties listed by title and not by name. And we would strongly recommend that because of the situation that you're talking about, that it requires more upkeep if you use names as the responsible party versus title. But that one, Dave, I would also say I'd like to just look into a little bit further and make sure I'm not misguiding anyone, and we'll post on a Q&A after the fact.
Okay. Thank you, Martha. Is IACUC required to review the plan during the semi-annual program review?
We have no regulatory authority over what the IACUC wants to do, so I would recommend speaking with your IACUC regarding that. We are not looking for any IACUC approval on your plan, if that's the question.
Okay, thank you. And I'm still getting a lot of questions on providing examples. I mean, I think you commented on that, but
yeah, and
yeah,
again, I would emphasize the examples are so difficult because each facility is so unique and so different. And that's why we've given the flexibility and really emphasized work with your local inspectors. we're happy to help. We've provided a lot of technical documents that are on our website to help you think through some of these things. So we don't have any samples or examples, but like I said, if you fill out that fillable form, you will be meeting the regulatory requirements. It's optional, you don't have to do it, but if you use that as a guide and use your inspectors as sounding boards, you should be fine.
Okay, thank you. The form has other issues or hazards. What are some examples of other issues or hazards?
Yeah, again, because each facility is so different, you really kind of have to think through that. But I think what we were thinking when we developed the form of an example is if you have flooding, then you may, electric issues may be a hazard that you may not have considered previously. So those are the things we just encourage you to kind of go through. We encourage you to look at our technical notes that we have that help kind of help you go through the process and ask some of these questions on what the hazards that may exist at your facilities are.
Okay, thank you, Martha. For the list of responsible personnel, do we need to list phone numbers and/or position/role titles sufficient?
Don, you want to take that one?
Yes. Yes, it's really the more information you have will be best. But there's not, like we said, if you have the position and you have the contact information, that's the most important thing. So however you decide you want to kind of ferret that out, that really is up to the facility. But the more information that you have on the plan, like Martha was saying, not so much the name of the people, but the position and contact information, the number is better.
Okay, thank you, Dawn. Is annual training required for all personnel or for those specified tasks in the plan?
So the training is required anytime there's a plan is put into place. So if there's been no changes to the plan via the regulations, there's no requirement for training. However, as Randall mentioned during his presentation, having safety days, retraining is always a good idea.
Okay, thank you. On the APHIS form section 2, and ask about conducting drills. Can you expand on what that means?
Randall, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so first example that comes to me is, well, obviously, a fire drill, or maybe an institution has public there, active shooter, it might be a drill for that. But the other one is a dangerous animal escape. You may have quarterly drills or what have you concerning that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Randy. If you have non-regulated species at your facility, should those be listed in this plan as well, such as birds and reptiles?
Yeah, I think we kind of covered this previously. So we're only regulating the animals that we regulate at this time. However, just be aware, we will be regulating birds as of next year, and it was strongly encouraged, if you're going through the process of developing a plan, it would be great to cover all of your animals, but certainly not a regulatory requirement.
Okay, thank you. Will our current emergency disaster preparedness plan be the equivalent to the contingency plan, or will we need to have both?
So provided that the plan that you have meets the the 4 requirements that our inspectors will be looking for, the who, the what, the when, and the how, then it should serve just fine. But that would really be at your discretion. You'd need to take a look at what's involved in your plan.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I'm a little confused on the expectations around documenting training. I thought documentation of training was not required, but it was stated that institutions are expected to document when the training occurred to verify that the employees were trained within the 30/days window. Please clarify.
Sure. So we're not requiring any documentation of the training in so much as we're not going to be looking for what did you train, how did you train, what courses did you give, how long were they. We're not looking for any of that other than just evidence that your personnel were trained and what date they were trained on, or by what date they were trained. Hopefully that clarifies it.
Okay, thank you. Will this recording be sent out to everyone afterwards? I can answer that. Yes, you will get a notification. This will be posted on the APHIS YouTube, and you'll be sent a link, and that link also will be put on that website that was in the presentation for contingency planning, so you can review it there as well. So did I hear correctly that we must document when personnel were trained? Would this include specifying individuals who were trained?
Yes, that's correct. You need to document who was trained and when they were trained.
Okay, thank you. Will training be required for volunteers at a facility or only paid employees?
So again, we leave that to the discretion of the facilities. If volunteers are a core part of their contingency plan, then their volunteers should be trained. But again, that's the discretion of the facility.
Okay. Do we need to have one kennel per all animals on site if transportation is needed? I'm not sure I followed the question. If you can clarify that, questioner, I'd appreciate it. Does your plan have to be named contingency plan, or can it be named something else like emergency plan?
Yeah, we don't care what you call your plan as long as it is a contingency plan. It has the 4 required elements: the who, the what, the when, and the how.
Okay, thank you. Will the inspectors go through these line by line? Will this be a citable offense if there is something that the inspector thinks should be in there, but you don't have it in your plan?
That's a good question. Our inspectors are not going to be ranking your plan. Only you know what you might expect at your facility. So our inspectors are going to just check, have you put those 4 elements: the who, the what, the when, and the how. Hopefully your plan is robust and you've thought of most everything. If an inspector thinks maybe there's something that you maybe overlooked, they could mention it, but that's not going to be something that we're going to cite. That's more just a courtesy, something to think about. We certainly hope that these contingency plans are living documents and they're continually upgraded and improved. But we're not going to be in the business of evaluating your plans and seeing, what did you forget? Because we realize there's a lot of issues, a lot of potential disasters or emergencies that could happen, and you're really the best source of knowing what those might be.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Does this need to be carried during animal shipments? If so, if the animal is traveling by another shipper who is required to have the contingency plan and sending/receiving facility or the shipper?
So the shipper should also have their own contingency plan in place, because emergencies can happen during transport, just as they can happen at a static facility. So both facilities should have a contingency plan in place.
Okay, thank you. If we don't use the template provided, does our plan need a signature?
No, and if you do use the template we provided, it doesn't need a signature. We're not looking for a signature. We're looking for the date that it was put into place and any modifications. Certainly have, if you want to have a signature for your own documentation, that's great, but a signature is not required.
Okay, thank you. How would an airline complete this plan? The employee turnover is vast.
Yeah, and that's why Don mentioned during the presentation that we really suggest putting the titles of who's responsible rather than names, because some places do have high turnover, and airlines are certainly one of those. Training would also be a little more challenging, because as soon as you bring someone on board, they would need to be trained within those 60 days. So I would just recommend that you keep that in mind, keep the plans based on title versus actual names of people.
Okay, thank you. AZA facilities are required to have contingency plans in place in order to be accredited. Is it appropriate to assume that meeting AZA requirements satisfies USDA requirements?
Provided that it has those 4 elements, the who, the what, the when, and the how, and you can show training and annual review, then it would meet the requirements.
Okay, thank you. Does the emergency holding facility have to be another USDA inspected facility in case of evacuation?
So there's no requirement of that, because we're talking about emergencies. Now, we would suggest you certainly plan ahead and ensure that any facility that you use is going to take good care of the animals. But when we're talking emergency situations, oftentimes our options are limited, especially when we're dealing with large numbers of animals or very large animals. So there's no requirements that I'm aware of that any emergency holding facility would need to be USDA regulated.
Okay, thank you, Martha. If we already have a contingency plan in place and have been training on it annually, do we need to reset the clock to the new dates?
I guess I'm not quite clear on that question, Dave. Maybe they can provide some clarity on it.
Okay. Next question. Martha stated mammals have to be covered. I'm assuming it excludes mice and rats bred for research in line with the AWA definition of regulated species.
Absolutely, that's correct. I should have been more specific. AWA regulated mammals. So you're correct, those would be excluded.
Next question, since this is a new requirement, what circumstances would lead to a citation? Would missing an emergency event in to your area be considered citable?
So really we go back to those 4 core parts of the plan: the who, the what, the when and the how. Does your plan cover those? Do you have annual review of your plan, and have you provided training to your personnel? Those are really the only things that we would cite for. We're not going to evaluate your plan. We're not going to ding you if you have a plan and things still go south. Hopefully you use that as a learning experience and your plan improves. When emergencies happen, things often don't go as planned. So we're not looking for the outcomes. We're not going to cite regarding that. We're looking for those key components of your plan.
Okay, thank you. Can the contingency plan be online, or do we need a hard copy?
So as long as you can provide it to the inspectors when they're at your facilities, that's all that's required.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Next question. In an emergency situation, is a person's residence an acceptable temporary holding place for animals?
So here again, we're not here to evaluate the quality of your plan. If you feel like that's a place where you should put your animals, we leave that up to your discretion. We're simply looking that you have a plan and it has those required elements in place.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Where does this regulation live? Is it now part of the Animal Welfare Act regulations? I'm only seeing contingency planning sections associated with older effective dates.
Yes, it is part of the new regulations. Some of our online materials have been updated and some of them have not been updated. If you go to the name escapes me, the electronic CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, they are updated there. If you want to email this email address, or heck, you could email me, any of our presenters, your inspectors, they can give you a link to the regulations, but we've also sent the regulations out to all of our licensees and registrants, either via email or via actual postal mail. So everyone, any licensed or registered facility should have received a copy of the regulations by now. But if you haven't, feel free to email us or contact any of the presenters, and we're happy to get you those.
Okay, thank you. If you're in Florida and you are required by Florida Fish and Wildlife to have a critical disaster plan to exhibit animals, does this cover the contingency plan for USDA?
Kind of the same answers I've given before, provided it has those components that I've mentioned a few times, then it would meet our requirements.
Okay, thank you. How detailed does Section 7 details needed to perform the task? Is there asking how much detail do you need in that particular block on the form? Consider physical materials, other resources, and training needed to be. Would refer to SOP be acceptable?
So I'm kind of sounding like a broken record, but really we leave that to your discretion. How detailed do you need to be? If referring to an SOP is all that you feel that your facility is going to need, that's great, and you've met the requirements because you have the details necessary, what task is going to be performed. So we leave that up to you on how best to meet that particular requirement.
Okay, thank you. I'm still not clear on the required documentation, i.e. you have stated that a document/record of of the training is not required, but it needs to be apparent that the training was done and on what date. Does this mean we can simply tell the inspector the date on which the training occurred?
Yeah, so somewhere there needs to be some record of the date that the training occurred for the personnel, but we're not requesting any specifics on what type of training took place.
Okay, thank you. What are potential fines if a plan is not considered complete by USDA inspector?
So that would be, so if we're getting into fines, that's getting kind of far into the process, and that would be at the discretion of further down the line inspectors. If they don't feel that the plan meets all of the requirements, can issue a citation.
Okay, thank you. I think you answered this one, but will tabletop exercises suffice as training, or is it actually hands-on exercise needed, i.e. an escaped animal?
Right, so again, we're not going to evaluate the training or the type of training. It's merely that we know that there was training done.
Okay. Another question. For our institution, phone numbers are assigned to an individual, not to a role. Since more information is better, if we list the responsible person's title and their phone number, would it be permissible to administratively update the phone number if the person filling the role changes, or would we need to conduct retraining?
I'm not sure I completely understand this question, Dave.
I think they're talking about using a role versus a phone number. They're asking, can you just use the phone number, I think.
I mean, again, it's up to the discretion of the facility. If by putting a phone number, they know who is the responsible party, and that works for them, then that would meet the requirements. If that's what's being asked, I apologize, I'm not completely clear on the question.
Okay. Again, if specific type of training is not required, then why does the form list drills?
So to be clear, the form is not required. So the form is simply there as a guide. So the form asks questions to get you thinking about things that may be useful for your facility. It may not be. So if you prefer to do drills, you think drills are important, you can use the form to mark those down. If you don't need to do drills, you don't have to put anything on the form. The form is completely optional. What we require on the plan is that you outline the who, the what, the when, and the how you'll implement your contingency plan.
Okay, thank you, Martha. We have 400 plus employees that we train for emergencies such as severe weather. Do we need to document training by individual?
Yes, we would need to see it, by individual the training dates.
Okay, thank you. Would a private owner of a regulated animal, not licensed or registered, that is allowing that animal to be used in a university research project, e.g. behavior, need a contingency plan?
So again, if the animal is not regulated by us, then they would not need to be included in the plan. It may be a good idea for you to consider that, especially if the animal happens to be at the facility when an emergency happens, but certainly not a regulatory requirement from us since they're not a covered animal.
Okay, thank you. Would it be acceptable to refer to a directory for contact information in order to keep the who with titles and not names?
Yeah, if that works for you and everyone understands how to use the directory, then that seems like that would be a very important or a very useful way to take care of that.
Okay, thank you. Our university has a rodeo and receives steers/calves from vendors for use during the rodeo season. We are the vendors, or are the vendors required to have a plan when shipping the animals to the university, and do they need to provide a copy to the university?
So I'm going to make a presumption that they're not covered animals just based on the description. In that case, since they're not a regulated animal by us at the time of shipment, they would not need a plan by us.
Okay, thank you. We have had a contingency plan in place since it was first required and have provided annual retraining of all staff, but the training is not tied to July 5th. For instance, we often do it during a fall staff meeting. Do we need to move our training to meet the 60 days after July 5th date? Our plan is already active now.
That's a really good question, and I'm going to go out on a limb with the caveat that I'm going to just double check this after the fact. But according to our regulations, it's 60 days after the plan was put into place. So if the plan was put into place in the fall, probably don't need to do retraining. But I'm going to double check that one. So that's an interesting question. And good job for having a plan in place already. That's great.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Is it correct to assume that when using a third-party shipper to transfer animals from one zoo to another, that the shipper is responsible for maintaining/creating their contingency plan?
That is absolutely correct. Emergencies can happen during shipment. Ground transport, your car can break down or your vehicle can break down. Air transport, lots of things can go wrong. So the shippers, any transporters, any intermediate handlers are also required to have a contingency plan in place.
Okay, thank you. That looks like about all the questions for now. Again, if you have a question, go ahead and submit it in the question box and we'll get to it here. We've got a few minutes. All right, that looks like about the end of the questions. Do you have any final comments, Martha?
No, I just appreciate everyone attending. I appreciate the questions. You've given me a few things to think about, and I will get back to you. Like I said, we'll post an abbreviated Q&A on our website once we get that together. I'll encourage everyone, again, please use your animal care inspectors as a resource. We're here, we're available to answer any questions, help you get into compliance. We're happy to look at your plans as you develop them, work with you. So reach out to them. Feel free to reach out to any of our presenters today. We're happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Martha. I'd like to thank our presenters, Randall Wagner and Don Barksdale, as well as our panelists, Bob Gibbons, Martha Keller, and Aaron Reiner for the presentation. You will receive a survey following this webinar, and we would appreciate your feedback. You will be notified when the recording is available on APHIS YouTube. Thank you for attending, and that concludes today's webinar.